day. Yesterday, or at least the day before the making of this program, Vladimir Putin, President of Russia, delivered what, in my opinion, is his most hardline and abrasive speech about the international situation and the military situation along Russia's borders that he has delivered not just this year, but for some time. Indeed, in terms of its tone, its confrontational tone towards the West, it can only be compared, in my opinion, to the speech that he made directly after the unification of Crimea to Russia, when he made a similar speech in similarly abrasive terms on Red Square. This speech was made at what is referred to as an expanded meeting of the Defense Ministry Board. This is a meeting that took place in Russia's Ministry of Defense, and it brought together, as we learn, the armed forces leadership, representatives of bodies of state power and public organizations, and it was attended by command officers from military districts, fleets and flotillas, military formations and units, as well as cadets and students of Russia's defense ministry's higher education institutions. And we're told that the latter have been invited to attend a meeting of this nature for the first time. Now, that is actually quite a radical step, and Russians who are familiar with their history will remember that something very similar happened in May 1941 in the run-up to the Second World War. In the run-up to the Second World War, to the German attack on the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, who was at that time the Soviet leader, held a very similar meeting in which he also spoke to Soviet army officers and also Soviet military cadets about the international situation, and made clear that a war with Germany was on the horizon. This is an event that has been the subject of much discussion and much questioning in various histories, and I would add that the full text of Stalin's speech at this meeting was only finally published by the Russian authorities sometime after the Soviet Union collapsed. If you want to learn more about this critically important meeting, my own view is that the best place to get a measured and balanced discussion of it is in Gorodetzky's book on Operation Barbarossa, which was published some years ago by Yale University Press. Anyway, Russians, and of course historically minded Russians, of whom there are a large number within the Russian military leadership. The Russian military leadership, unlike military officers in some other countries, is educated in political and military history as part of their military education. They will, of course, inevitably be making a comparison between that speech that Stalin made, that meeting that took place in May 1941, and this latest meeting that has taken place in the board of the Ministry of Defense, and in which Putin made, as I said, this very abrasive speech. Anyway, this time, unlike the case with Stalin's speech in May 1941, this particular speech has been published in full by the Russian presidential website. Now, I should say at once that Putin was not the only person, of course, to speak at this meeting, and one of the other keynote speakers was Sergei Shoigu, the Russian Minister of Defense. He has provided a detailed discussion of the state of the Russian armed forces and of the international situation. It's a sort of formal report from the Minister of Defense to the Russian president, to Putin himself, but also to the leadership of the armed forces about the state of the armed forces. And rather than cover this massively long report. I'm providing a link at after this video. Suffice to say that what the state of the armed forces, which Shoigu describes, is of a military that has been reorganized, whose morale has been restored, which has been reinforced by new generations of well-trained officers, that has widespread support and trust amongst the Russian population, and which is increasingly being re-equipped with ever more advanced weapons, with priority given to Russia's strategic defense forces. Anyway, to get an overview of the report or to read it, you can do it all yourself. As I said, I provided a link. Now, about Putin's speech, which is obviously going to be the centerpiece of this program, I'm going to skip the points where he discusses the state of the military and also the conditions of Russian military officers, their living standards, their barrack and living accommodations, things of that nature. Very important to a military that still remembers the bitter and difficult times of the 1990s. Again, there's a link provided to Putin's speech, and you can read all of that if you wish. But I'm going to focus instead on the military political situation, and I'm going to read out what Putin said there. The sort of things that Putin said about the military political situation in the world. And this is what he said. The military political situation in the world remains complicated, with increased conflict potential and new seats of tension in several regions. In particular, the growth of the US and NATO military forces in direct proximity to the Russian border and major military drills, including unscheduled ones, are a cause for concern. It is extremely alarming that elements of the US global defense system are being deployed near Russia. The Mark 41 launchers, which are located in Romania and are to be deployed in Poland, are adapted for launching the Tomahawk strike missiles. If this infrastructure continues to move forward, and if US and NATO missile systems are deployed in Ukraine, their flight time to Moscow will be only 7 to 10 minutes, or even 5 minutes for hypersonic systems. This is a huge challenge for us, for our security. As you are aware, I invited the US President to start talks on the drafting of concrete agreements. Incidentally, during our conversation, he actually proposed appointing senior officials to oversee this sphere. It was in response to his proposal that we drafted our proposals on precluding the further eastward expansion of NATO and the deployment of offensive strike systems in the countries bordering on Russia. As you are aware, we have sent the drafts of relevant agreements to our American colleagues and the NATO leadership. We need long-term legally binding guarantees. Well, we know very well that even legal guarantees cannot be completely fail-safe, because the United States easily pulls out of any international treaty that has ceased to be interesting to it for some reason, sometimes offering explanations and sometimes not, as was the case with the ABM and the Open Skies treaties, nothing at all. However, we need at least something, at least a legally binding agreement, rather than just verbal assurances. We know the worth of such verbal assurances, fine words and promises. Take the recent past. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, when we were told that our concerns about NATO's potential expansion eastwards were absolutely groundless, and then we saw 5 waves of the bloc's eastward expansion. Do you remember how it happened? All of you are adults. It happened at a time when Russia's relations with the United States and main members of NATO were cloudless, if not completely allied. I have already said this in public and will remind you of this again. American specialists were permanently present at the nuclear arms facilities of the Russian Federation. They went to their office there every day, had desks and an American flag. Wasn't this enough? What else is required? US advisors worked in the Russian government, career CIA officers gave their advice. What else did they want? What was the point of supporting separatism in the North Caucasus with the help of even ISIS? Well, if not ISIS, there were other terrorist groups. They obviously supported terrorists. What for? What was the point of expanding NATO and withdrawing from the anti-ballistic missile treaty? They are to blame for what is happening in Europe now, for the escalation of tensions there. Russia had to respond at every step, and the situation was continuously going from bad to worse. It was deteriorating all the time. And here we are today in a situation when we are forced to resolve it. After all, we cannot allow the scenario I mentioned. Is anyone unable to grasp this? This should be clear. Sometimes I wonder, why did they do all this in the then conditions? This is unclear. I think the reason lies in the euphoria from their victory in the so-called Cold War, or the so-called victory in the Cold War. This was due to their wrong assessment of the situation at that time, due to their unprofessional, wrong analysis of probable scenarios. There are simply no other reasons. I would like to emphasize again, we are not demanding any special exclusive terms for ourselves. Russia stands for equal and indivisible security in the whole of Eurasia. Naturally, as I have already noted, if our Western colleagues continue their obviously aggressive line, we will take appropriate military technical reciprocal measures and will have a tough response to their unfriendly steps. And I will like to stress that we are fully entitled to these actions and are designed to ensure Russia's security and independence. As we know well, they are operating thousands of kilometers away from their national territory under different pretexts, including the need to ensure their own security. When international law and the United Nations Charter get in their way, they declare them obsolete and unnecessary. However, when something meets their interests, they immediately refer to the norms of international law, the UN Charter, international humanitarian law, and so on. These manipulations are annoying. In this connection, as I have said, it is important to continue planned, steady, systematic development of the armed forces, including in line with the priorities set forth in the latest version of the National Security Strategy and the concept for building and developing the armed forces through to 2030. And then after the discussion, after hearing Shoigu's report, Putin returned and had more to say. And he said as follows: I would like to add a few words to what the minister said and what I said in my opening remarks. Everyone is discussing this, and of course, primarily the armed forces. I am referring to our documents, our draft treaties and agreements on ensuring strategic stability that we sent to the leadership of the United States and NATO. We already see that some of our detractors are interpreting them as Russia's ultimatum. Is it an ultimatum or not? Of course not. As a reminder, everything that our partners, let us call them that, the United States has been doing in previous years, supposedly ensuring its interests and security thousands of kilometers away from their national security. They have been doing these tough things, the boldest things, without UN Security Council authorization. What was the pretext to bomb Yugoslavia? Was it authorized by the Security Council or what? Where is Yugoslavia and where is the United States? They destroyed the country. Indeed, there was an internal conflict. They had their own problems, but who gave them the right to conduct airstrikes against a European capital? No one did. They just chose to do so, and their satellites were running behind them, yelping along. So much for international law. Under what pretext did they go into Iraq? It was Iraq developing weapons of mass destruction. They went in, destroyed the country, created a hotbed of international terrorism, and then it turned out that they made a mistake. The intelligence failed us. Wow! They destroyed a country. The intelligence failed. That is all they had to say to justify their actions. It turned out that there were no weapons of mass destruction there. On the contrary, everything had been destroyed as agreed. How did they go into Syria? With Security Council authorization? No, they do as they please. However, what they are doing or trying or planning to do in Ukraine is not happening thousands of kilometers away from our national border. It is on the doorstep of our house. They must understand that we simply have nowhere further to retreat to. There are experts here sitting with us. I stay in constant contact with them. The United States does not possess hypersonic weapons yet, but we know when they will have it. It cannot be hidden. Everything goes on record, successful or unsuccessful tests alike. We have a sense of when it might happen. They will supply hypersonic weapons to Ukraine and then use them as cover. That does not mean they will start using them tomorrow, because we already have Zircon and they do not. To arm extremists from a neighboring state and incite them against certain regions of the Russian Federation, such as Crimea, when they think circumstances are favorable. Do they really think we do not see these threats? Or do they think that we will just stand idly watching threats to Russia emerge? This is the problem. We simply have no room to retreat. That is the question. Armed conflicts and bloodshed are absolutely not our choice. We do not want to see events get that way. We want to use political and diplomatic means to resolve problems, but we want to at least have clearly formulated legal guarantees. This is what our proposals are all about. We sent them down on paper and sent them to Brussels and Washington, and we hope to receive a clear and comprehensive response to these proposals. There are certain signals that our partners appear to be willing to work on that. However, there is also a danger that they will attempt to drown out our proposals in words or in a swamp in order to take advantage of this pause and do whatever they want to do. To make it clear to everyone, we are aware of this, and this turn of events, these developments will not work for us. We look forward to constructive and meaningful talks with a visible outcome and within a definite time frame that would ensure equal security for all. That is what we will strive to achieve, but we can do so only after the armed forces are developing properly. So, what is Putin saying here? It's, as I said, abrasive, it's absolutely clear, it allows for no real ambiguity. What he is saying is that the United States and the Western powers cannot be trusted. They've disregarded international law when it suits them. They've waged wars in places like Yugoslavia, Iraq, Syria, and other places without authorization from the UN Security Council. They've not only disregarded international law, but they referred to it as obsolete when it suited them, though they rush back and say that international law does apply when it suits them also. They have, in other words, a manipulative approach to international law. They have now engineered a situation in Ukraine where that country and its armed forces have become hostile to Russia, even though it is on Russia's doorstep. And the Russians are seriously concerned that the United States, that the Western powers, are going to build up the military in Ukraine to the point where it could conceivably pose a threat to Russia as well. In light of this, the Russians have proposed certain draft treaties to the Western powers. These I have discussed in a recent program. I've explained how these treaties, these draft treaties, in effect not only end the eastward extension of NATO, but they they roll back to a very great extent that eastward expansion which has already happened by obliging NATO to dismantle all its infrastructure in the former countries and the countries of the former Warsaw Pact. And they also, the draft treaties also make clear that the United States and the Western powers are not to have any sort of military footprint whatsoever in any of the former republics of the Soviet Union, except, of course, for the Baltic states, which are now part of NATO. So those are the treaties that the Russians have proposed. Putin is saying that so far he's hearing from the United States that the United States is willing to discuss these draft agreements. They're willing to engage in constructive discussions. But if the United States, if the Western powers spin out that negotiation for a long time, then the Russians will notice this, will realize that these negotiations are not being conducted in good faith, and will take appropriate countermeasures. Now, he doesn't spell out what those countermeasures will be, but he does say that they will take the form of a military technical nature. And just as Stalin did in that meeting in May 1941, when he told, in effect, the military, the Russian military, the Soviet military as it was then, to prepare for conflict, in effect, it seems to me, that is what Putin is saying now. He's saying that it's not his choice, it's not Russia's choice. They still see room for a diplomatic settlement, but at some point, if these problems, if these concerns that the Russians have are not addressed, the Russians reserve the right to take whatever steps they judge appropriate to ensure their security, and that means something of a military technical nature. In other words, some form of military response. Could not be clearer. Now, note how careful Putin is to say that the draft treaties, as proposed, are not an ultimatum. Now, I've said in previous programs that they edge towards becoming an ultimatum, but they are not that at the moment. An ultimatum is when demands are put to the other side is asked to accept those demands, or rather is the demand made of the other side is that they accept those demands in full, without change or amendment, and failing that, the party that is making the ultimatum reserves the right, or in fact makes clear its intention to take military action. Now, we are, as Putin correctly says, and as I pointed out in previous programs, I've noticed other people have been increasingly referring to these documents as an ultimatum. We're not quite there yet. The Russians are still prepared to negotiate. They are still prepared to engage the Western powers in discussions. But Putin has made it very clear in this speech that eventually, if there is no real sincere approach to engaging with Russia on these issues, then at some point, and Putin speaks again of a definite time frame, at some point, some kind of ultimatum will no doubt come. Now, I'm going to say straight away, I think that the Russians at the moment, despite the fact that they've been saying that these proposals that they are making are not a menu where the United States can pick what it wants and decide what it doesn't want. Russian foreign ministry officials have been saying all of that. In my opinion, the Russians at the moment would accept certain other assurances from the West. If, for example, the United States were to cease military deliveries of military equipment to Ukraine, were to advise Ukraine to negotiate with the leaders of the two Donbass republics, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, with a view to implementing the Minsk Agreement, and if the United States were to give assurances to Russia that there are no plans or intentions to admit Ukraine into NATO. If the United States were prepared to do those things, then, in my opinion, much of the tension that exists in Europe today would be diffused, and at that point there would be much more time and space to discuss these draft treaties and perhaps to find some sort of way to an acceptable compromise. But it would require the United States to take those sort of steps. At the moment, one gets the sense that there's a debate and a discussion about this in Washington, with some idea that the Russians perhaps can be pacified by giving them some woolly assurances about the Minsk Agreement and about a postponement of Ukraine's NATO membership. But I think if that is all the United States is prepared to offer, I don't think it's going to be anywhere near enough, and we're going to see the Russian position hardening further. So it seems to me that we are now in a situation where tensions are going to increase unless there are negotiations very soon. And I think the Western powers need to understand that very quickly and start to negotiate in earnest if there isn't to be a very serious crisis in Europe. To be very clear, a crisis in Europe worse than anything we have seen since the end of the Second World War. And I'm going to add that it's possible, it's just possible, that Western leaders are starting to wake up to these dangers. It's interesting to see that the Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, has apparently had a lengthy discussion with Putin. And of course, Emmanuel Macron has also called Putin and had a further discussion with him. So it could be that some kind of talk, some kind of negotiations are taking place on the margins. But it seems to me that the Western governments, Western powers, if they are to avoid a crisis in Europe, a debacle, in other words, in Europe, because to be very clear, I cannot imagine that this is going to escalate into a general war, but a crisis in Europe which could result in a total breakdown in relations between Russia and the West, and a military debacle for the West in Ukraine. If that is to be avoided, then those discussions in earnest have to happen quickly. Now, I'm going to add one final word, which is, of course, as discussed by Alex Christoforo and myself on our main channel, the Duran. There is currently a festering political crisis in Ukraine. President Zelensky his government is now seeking to bring treason charges against the former president Petro Poroshenko, on top of the treason charges brought against Ukraine's most important principal opposition leader, Viktor Medvedchuk. He's again talking about a potential coup. Zelensky's again talking about a potential coup against himself. And I read a further article in Radio Liberty, of all places, which again grudgingly admits that Ukraine's military is in no position to put up a fight, a sustained fight against Russia in the event that there is a conflict in Ukraine. So already we see how the clock is now ticking, how the crisis in Ukraine is deepening. We have a deepening energy crisis in Europe, and of course the situation in Ukraine itself is getting worse, with the Ukrainian military in no position to offer any sustained resistance to the military of Russia. So, as I said, I think that the clock is ticking. There is still time, but the need to enter into substantive negotiations is now becoming compelling. I've heard that the United States intends to engage Russia in substantive talks on strategic stability questions in January. In other words, after the Christmas and New Year holidays. I sincerely hope that this is indeed the case, and that these talks are serious, and that they're not just a smokescreen for further inaction. Well, we shall see. But as I said, these comments of Putin's make it very clear that the Russians are in deadly earnest about what they're saying, and that we are closer to a major conflict in Europe than we have ever been at any point since the end of the Second World War. Thank you for joining me again today for this program. I look forward to you joining me again soon in future programs on this channel. I also look forward to you joining us on our main channel, the Duran. You'll find links under this video. Please also remember to check us out on Locals, where we are our principal secondary platform, where we have a thriving community, where we are publishing increasing amounts of exclusive content, where I do live streams now every Wednesday, and where we are becoming an increasingly active presence. And you can also find us on our various other platforms: BitChute, Library, Rumble, ODYSEE, SuperU, and all the rest. And you can also join us, and also you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying the amazing things you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again in future programs. If you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button, and please check your subscription to this channel. Look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.